My name is Sarah Lloyd. I work for the Wisconsin Farmers Union, and I also work for the Wisconsin Food Hub Cooperative, which is a farmer co-op primarily doing fresh produce aggregating into grocery, wholesale, and food service markets in Wisconsin. And that is a project that Wisconsin Farmers Union worked on with a group of farmers. And so I'm going to talk to you today about some work looking at fair labor on farms in sustainable agriculture that we've been doing in Wisconsin. And so, you know, obviously there's a lot of different labor on farms depending on what you're producing, depending on the scale you have. This is actually my husband and I, we farm with his family on a 350 cow conventional dairy farm in Wisconsin, and he's home milking cows and helping new moms, and I work off the farm to bring health insurance back to the family, but also for my own interests and my own professional desires. But you know, farming is a lot of work, and there's a lot of difference between the work that the family does in the farm and then what happens when you start hiring labor. And so I want to just tell you about the two labor research projects that I personally have been involved in. So I was part of study of immigrant labor on Wisconsin dairy farms that took place from like 2006 to 2011. This is a figure that you probably hear quoted if you hear about Wisconsin dairy farms and labor. There was very little known about how much immigrant labor was being used on Wisconsin dairy farms. There was a lot of speculation. Our survey and interview data show that 40% of the labor force of Wisconsin dairy farms was immigrant workers, and that was already 10 years ago. So, and there hasn't been a quantitative update on that. So we can assume that that percentage is higher now. But we did focus groups. We surveyed 83 dairy farms, including 103 US-born workers and 270 immigrant workers. We did in-depth interviews with immigrant workers as well as 20 farmers that were originally surveyed. You can find the kind of public fact sheets on the Program for Agricultural Technology Studies at Wisconsin. And then there were 2 academic articles published looking at the vulnerability of immigrant workers, and also then how do farmers explain the way that they are moving back and forth between US-born and immigrant workers, and what does that mean for farmers and workers? So I'm going to mostly talk about this CSA case study that is not part of this, but this look at labor kind of shows the complexity of the issue, and I appreciated very much, Mary, your slide showing the complexity of the issue. There's a lot going on. What I'm going to tell you most about today is this project that I have been working on with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Center for Integrated Ag Systems. This is an AFRI grant project. Also, it's looking at small and mid-scale farms to try to understand issues of labor within a context of domestic fair trade. And I will kind of tell you how we're thinking about that. But it's important also to know that this is a group of researchers from economics, sociology, human ecology, law, and anthropology. We have NGOs. We have UW Extension. Oops, then you were supposed to stop talking now. Oh. Okay, yeah. UW Center for Integrated Ag Systems is the principal, then Extension School for Workers, which we have at UW, the Farmers Union, the Domestic Fair Trade Association, and the Labor Network for Sustainability. So those are the partners. And there's a website at the Center for Integrated Ag Systems. So first, let's talk about, okay, fair trade. What do we mean when we talk about fair trade? So I guess think of a banana, but don't just think of a banana. I mean, most people think like fair trade, oh yeah, I go to the store and there's a little sticker on my banana that says that it's fair. And then I feel good about buying it and maybe I pay a little bit more for it because it's been certified and it has this label. But in the context of this research, we have been expanding the categories of thinking about fair trade and thinking about opportunities for coalitions to build fairness into the system. Certification as one way that you might build fairness by creating sort of this knowledge of the supply chain, but also then negotiations. What are the opportunities for you to negotiate the situation that you hold in the supply chain? And then what is the way that that's enacted through policy? But we're talking about both kind of big P policy that you might think of that's like government policy, and little p policy, which we're thinking about as, you know, institutions or in some ways municipalities, but institutions may decide like their procurement policy, and we're referring to that as little p. So we've kind of identified sort of 4 buckets where you might think about how we're building fairness into supply chains and agriculture. Obviously these are not always mutually exclusive, they kind of work together in some ways. And the other part of this research project looking at domestic fair trade was that we're looking at it in the context of the ag of the middle. And if you're not familiar with that concept, this is kind of a weird slide, but I actually use this a lot when I'm urging 19-year-old dairy farmers in Wisconsin that have 100 cows to think about their position in the marketplace and what their opportunities are. And what we know in Wisconsin and in the US is that we're losing the mid-scale farms. We're losing the family-scaled farms. They're increasingly having difficulty competing in the marketplace. And there's a whole set of rural sociologists, sociovag, researchers from mostly land-grant universities that have been working over 20 plus years on this, what are we doing with the ag of the middle? Because if you look, you can think about that you can produce a small amount of product and try to get a premium price. You go to the farmer's market, you do a CSA, maybe you do high-end internet sales, you're doing a value-added product. You can do what the university tells you to do, what standard agriculture tells you to do, which is you're gonna get big, you're gonna get economies of scale, you might get a low margin, but you're producing a high volume. This is where my family is. This is where our farm is. We milk 350 cows. That sounds huge, I'm sure, to a lot of you, but we're actually like a very middle-sized farm. And if you went out to California, we're an ant with 350 cows. But we're in that troubled zone because we're selling our product into commodity markets and we are not achieving an economy of scale if there really is one, and we are struggling. And so, you know, what the researchers and activists and advocates and practitioners have been working on is trying to figure out, you know, what's the option for the mid-scale commodity producer. I mean, yeah, some are going to get bigger, but if we're thinking about good options, can we get people into those value-added markets? Can we get people into strategic alliances, collaborations, cooperatives? So I mentioned I work for the Wisconsin Food Hub Cooperative. That's what we're trying to do. We're bringing 40 farmers together to aggregate their product, to try to get it into the market. So each individual farm is producing what they want, but we're able to act on a bigger scale. So that's just, when you talk about agriculture in the middle, that's the vision behind of like, we need to do something for these mid-scale farms. And you're looking at a mid-scale farmer that's struggling mightily. So when we looked at the domestic fair trade issue. We actually have 6 main cases that were part of this AFRI study. I'm going to talk more specifically about the CSA farm case, but we took a look at Organic Valley, which is a very successful cooperative, started in Wisconsin, but is national. Looked at their supply chain partners and the way that one could look at fairness. We looked at $15 an hour minimum wage campaigns in California and New York, and what's the implication for agriculture in that. We looked at the Milk with Dignity campaign in the Northeast. If you aren't familiar, a group of immigrant dairy workers and some advocates pushed up the supply chain on Ben & Jerry's to demand better working conditions and got some success in their demands by strategically working through that supply chain with a high-profile brand. We have looked at the Dairy Grazing Apprenticeship Program, which is a very unique mentoring and slow equity transfer opportunity for people to get started in farming. And we've also looked at good procurement policies that institutions and cities may be setting up. So those are just the cases that are all part of the AFRI study. They're not published at this point. We're working on, the cases have been written. I'm writing the overview, so I'll let you know when that's done. No, but we're working together as a team, and look for that, because it'll be a comprehensive look at fairness. And one other concept that I just want to bring in that's informing this work is actually an international conceptualization of fairness, which actually is decent. What is decent work? And I think, when we're thinking about how we want to talk about this, how we might study it, how we might know it when we see it, the ILO, the International Labor Organization, and now the Food and Ag Organization, the FAO, which is kind of a UN body, have adopted decent work. It's something that is defined as opportunities for women and men to obtain decent and productive work in conditions of freedom, equity, security, and human dignity. So if you're a scientist, or a farmer, or a community member, that's a pretty tall order, but it certainly is something that I can get behind, like freedom, equity, security, and dignity. Yay, that all sounds good to me. So I think the complex puzzle of how we do that, how we might look at it, how we might help people get to that and actualize it is important. So we looked at the CSA model in the Upper Midwest context. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we found out in this case. This is a qualitative case study. We had 2 focus groups with CSA farmers in Wisconsin. We did 1 focus group with CSA farm workers. And then we did in-depth interviews with 3 CSA farms in Wisconsin. So that's what we're basing the case report on. And just a little background on CSA. I am assuming that everyone knows what CSA means, but community supported agriculture, I should have said that a long time before, is the, folks are getting usually a weekly box of vegetables, they've paid in advance, they're in a social and economic direct relationship with the farm. They may come out to the farm, perhaps they even do some exchange of work on the farm in exchange for a set amount of vegetables on a certain schedule. But one of the critiques of CSA has certainly been that the labor relationships have not really been explored very much. Like we don't really talk about them. We don't talk about the farmer self-exploitation, and we don't talk about the farmer hired labor. And that like other forms of alternative or sustainable ag models, we you can see that they are idealized and romanticized to some extent. And I just point you to some examples in social science literature where people have kind of started to unpack things in alternative or sustainable agriculture. And so if you're interested in kind of understanding what some of the critiques are, but a kind of idealized or romanticized thing going on looking at CSAs. But CSA has been seen as a strategy for farmers to be in direct relationship with consumers and to actually avoid troubles and vulnerabilities of commodity markets. So that's, you know, one of the reasons that people like the model, they want to go to the model. And our case study shows that CSAs that are explicitly working to deepen their relationship with their eaters, with their members, with their consumers, to share the risk, that actually the self-exploitation issues have been moderated or mitigated. So the anecdote from one of the in-depth interviews is one of the CSA farms told the story that their group of members, their core group of members, came to them one winter and said, we want to pay more for our weekly box of vegetables because we know that you don't have good health insurance. And so as a group of members of your CSA that are in a relationship with you and the farm, we want to up our weekly box rate so you can get health insurance. So that is a very unique opportunity in this particular supply chain relationship where, you know, self-exploitation or exploitation of the farmer's labor and the health of the human farmer, the owner, can be kind of moderated or mitigated or improved because of that relationship, because of the social relationship. When we were talking with the CSA farm workers, there were some things that came out in the focus group, and we point to some places in the sociology and social science literature that were confirmed by our CSA case. So the price of proximity was very real in talking with the farm workers, and most of the CSA farmers in our focus groups were very aware of this too. So the price of proximity is that issue where maybe your workers are living in your house with you. If you're a small farmer, maybe they're living in a little, you know, outbuilding on your farm. You're very close to them. Maybe you only have 1 or 2 workers and you're working side by side with them every day. And so we had quotes from our focus groups like, you get to know the farmer that you're working with, and sometimes they have a really small crew. You feel guilty because you are asking them for money. That is underlying the labor dynamic, but they're not clear conversations. Is this an 8-hour day or a 13-hour day? So workers really express like kind of inability or hesitancy to say, what's the deal here? Like, what's the protocol? Like, what's the plan? Am I coming here at 8 a.m.? Am I gonna go home before dark or not? I don't know. People reported other workers not reporting their full hours because they knew how much the farmer was struggling to make ends meet. Feelings get in the way in the small scale. So, you know, obviously we want to create just relationships in the labor relationships. But if things are unclear, if there's no protocol, if things are tight, you know, how do we help improve that possibility? And then just the kind of precarious nature, agricultural workers in general. This is certainly what we found with the immigrant workers because of their vulnerability to the legal status of their work status in the country. But then CSA farm workers express this due to often to the seasonality of the work in the upper Midwest. This is certainly different in other parts of the country, but you know, the fact that you might have a job from April to October, and then you're kind of like, oh, now what do I do? Plus your housing was probably tied to your work on the farm, so suddenly you don't have a place to live. So you don't have an income and you don't have a place to live. And so people talked about, well, I really like this, so I go out and work at UPS and then I come back. But a lot of people discussed that it was very stressful. It was something that the farm workers really said, well, I just can't do this for very long. It's just too unsettled. And that was a real problem. Also for worker retention, for people saying like, I'll come back. And then you have that issue that Mary brought up of like, well, you got to retrain somebody every year because you can't keep people coming back. Now, interestingly, CSA farmers reported this uncomfortable feeling to say, well, sometimes maybe it's okay that we get new people every year because we can't afford to give them raises. And they're like, ooh, and they knew, they were like, I hate to say this, it's really terrible, but I mean, that's the reality. Like you get a fresh batch of people, you start them out at the base level because that's all you can afford. And so that's obviously a problem. But one thing that we were kind of interested in looking at a little bit is, okay, we have this very unique model. You have this direct relationship. People are paying in advance. They care about the farm and the farmer. Does the member involvement in the CSA provide any interesting ways that the farm workers on the CSA farm would have more negotiating or more position to have a good work relationship on the farm? And we did not find, I mean, clearly we had one focus group of CSA farm workers, so it deserves more study, that the workers that we have talked to did not feel like they were really in close connection to the members, that they were, again, this sort of unseen. Maybe if the CSA farm also had a farmer's market, oftentimes it's the workers that's the front face at the farmer's market, and so then it was then that they might interact with the members if the members were picking up their boxes there. But we did not find that opportunity of the closeness of the eaters to the farm benefited the workers. But again, we have one focus group, so someone else should study that more to see. And so I'll just kind of wrap this up here. Farmers do want to be good people managers. The focus groups that we did, there was just a lot of angst and a lot of and we're all Midwestern, so we're like, oh, I feel bad. We want to be better, and I didn't get in this to manage people, and oh my gosh. And so we had a lot of conversations too about like the difference between the sons and daughters working and the hired workers and what the difficulty of that mix sometimes. And that really farmers said, can you give us some guidance? Like, could you give us some checklists? So I'm really excited about the things that Mary and her team are putting together, because we heard that loud and clear from our Wisconsin CSA farmers that they wanted some toolkit stuff to, and the farm workers said, like, even if someone had just sat down with me one time in the beginning of the season and just gone through, like, this is what we expect, this is the deal, like that, they said that would have been 100% better, because there was just nothing. There was no understanding what the expectations were in many cases. Workers want some guidance on what the actual law is, because again, as agricultural workers, they're not covered by a lot of laws. We did create a farm worker card. I don't know, there's some sitting on that front table. I was passing them around. There's some on the CIS table too. So that was one product of the research, was an informational pocket card that workers could have, that it's specific to Wisconsin. So again, it's not gonna transfer to your states, all your states, but that was something, and we translated into Spanish also as part of the project, to just help people, well, know your rights, and there's a phone number on there that they can call if they need some help and assistance. But one key thing that in all of the folks that are here at this conference and in Extension and in the Farm Credit Banks and FSA, that there's a sense that the farms that are more financially stable have more space to think about how to make better labor relationships, which is, you know, sociologists are good at pointing out the obvious, like, duh. But, you know, it really struck us in the interviews and the focus groups, and then, you know, we interact with lots of CSA farms, and that people that just had figured out a way to make their farms go around economically just had space to try to deal with the labor relationships. Again, we have this case study. We need more, you know, more people working on this to understand it more fully. But it also matches what we learned in the immigrant labor on dairy farms case. One of the relatively controversial findings of the immigrant labor on dairy farms case that's spelled out in the Social Problems journal article, if you want to read it, is that the larger the farm, the better the labor relationships were. I mean, we were able to do some statistical analysis on wages and benefit packages, and the bigger farms were able to offer those managerial and sub-managerial positions that smaller farms were not able to offer. So from just looking at the labor relationships, the 1,000 cow dairies are offering a more stable, better set of packages. They have a manager that just deals with HR stuff, and that, you know, Jill Harrison, who's at CU in Boulder, she has presented on that a lot and gets a lot of pushback, because I don't like factory farms. I will say that as a dairy farmer, but it's, you know, when you start, if you're just looking at the labor relationships, like, what are we doing to make sure that we can create good, stable, fair labor relationships down into scales that we might think are better for ecological issues, better for rural community issues, better for family farm issues. So that's, you know, one of those tricky areas in this, as we are pragmatic but think about the ideal. And then in general, if we look at all those case studies, I listed all the case studies in the study, is that the opportunity and possibility for decent and fair labor relationships is in the space of collective action rather than individual action. So I will leave that as a teaser, and obviously we will be exploring that a little bit more as we try to synthesize all the cases together. But I think it speaks to the place that we are in our political economy of agriculture right now too, is that how are we creating collective action to improve the situation of workers, of farmers, of eaters, and the community. So that's what I got.